Hey, today we're going to talk about carbon in aquatic systems. This is a pretty big topic. There are different forms of carbon. So there's organic and inorganic carbon, and we're going to break down what each of those things mean. But carbon is the currency of energy exchange in ecosystems, and it's the primary building block of life on Earth. Organic carbon comes from living things. So once plants fix carbon dioxide and becomes part of a plant's tissue, all of a sudden it's organic carbon. And then it might move on through other organic and inorganic stages as it moves through food webs. Organic carbon tends to have CH bonds, carbon hydrogen bonds, and that's different sometimes from inorganic carbon, although there are a few hydrogen atoms in inorganic carbon molecules. Inorganic carbon is derived from minerals or from non-living sources. So carbon dioxide, even though it comes from the respiration process, we call it when you take something organic and turn it into CO2, we call that mineralizing it. Carbonate and bicarbonate, carbonic acid, these are parts of the kind of water-based carbon buffer system that I'll talk about in more depth. And then other carbon oxygen, carbon sulfur, carbon nitrogen compounds can be inorganic as well. Carbon dioxide, of course, as you know, I'm sure you've heard, has been increasing in the atmosphere, especially in the past 100, 200 years. And more recently, it's been increasing at a rate of about 3.5% per decade. We are currently at around 417 parts per million. So well above the 400 ppm line. And you can see we have not been this high in the past 10,000 years or much longer than that. So really high concentrations of CO2, even though they're still in the parts per million range. So overall small fractions of the atmosphere, but really important in terms of how it functions. So if you want to see just how things have changed over the last, 50, 60 years, you could find your birthday parts per million CO2 for whatever year you were born. So when were you born, and figure out what the CO2 levels were like. And remember that this kind of saw blade shape going up, that's because of the more massive landmass in the northern hemisphere, and so more plants in the northern hemisphere taking up CO2. So what you see is that the rates go up in the wintertime for the northern hemisphere, and then rates in the atmosphere of CO2 go down in the summertime when all those plants are taking up CO2, and that's why you get this really regular saw blade shape. So the carbonate buffer system basically is a movement of carbon from different forms in water. When carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it produces carbonic acid. So this first equation is CO2 plus water goes to carbonic acid and sometimes back and forth. So there's an equilibrium here, and that's what those double arrows mean. And carbonic acid is not stable, and so can go back and forth between CO2 and carbonic acid. If the pH goes a little bit higher, the carbonic acid can dissociate into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. And what happens is, so if the pH is pushed to the more basic side of the equilibrium, it creates bicarbonate and it creates a proton, which then pushes the pH back, right? So pH concentrations, we know, are the concentrations of hydrogen ions or protons in solution. And so this is why the kind of overall change in pH is minimized because of this buffering system. So this is what's called the first dissociation of carbonic acid, is the production of bicarbonate and a proton. And then that bicarbonate, again, if the pH is pushed to more basic solution, will dissociate into carbonate and two protons. Okay, so this is the second dissociation of carbonic acid. And again pushes the pH back to more acidic. So the pH of the water is influencing each of these steps and then also being influenced by these steps. And so it's this really cool feedback system. So here's kind of a picture of what's going on. You have pH scale along the bottom, and you have at really low pHs, like around 4 or 5, you mainly have dissolved CO2 and carbonic acid in solution. You don't have things like bicarbonate or carbonate because they're not stable. They don't stay in solution. They dissociate into carbonic acid and carbon dioxide and protons. As the pH increases, then that carbonic acid transitions and bicarbonate is formed, okay? And so then at pHs around 6 to 9.5, the majority of the carbon in water is in this form of bicarbonate. And the colors, the kind of bars of colors, the green is rainwater, the blue in the middle is freshwater, and the kind of aqua color on the right is marine, is like, seawater. You can see that most of the water bodies on Earth, the freshwater and marine water, are in this kind of neutral pH where bicarbonate is the main source of carbon, or the main form that carbon takes in water. And so what's really neat about this is that when the pH, when like acid rain, it comes into the system, it lowers the pH, but then that basically the bicarbonate, this buffering system helps bring the pH back towards neutral, and vice versa. If the pH gets raised too high, then it brings it back. And so the shifts in carbon among these different sources between carbonic acid, bicarbonate, and carbonate help to kind of regulate pH in the system. So this carbonate system buffers aquatic systems against rapid changes in pH. And especially, this is really true in limestone watersheds where there's a lot of carbonate, bicarbonate in the rock. And so as acid rain hits this, that's carbon becomes dissolved in the water. Okay. So you can see these parts of the carbonate buffering system when you do some things around the kitchen. So if you take bicarbonate, which is baking soda, and you add an acid to it like vinegar, all of a sudden it will spontaneously start forming a bunch of bubbles. Well, those bubbles are CO2 being released. Okay, so those are gas bubbles, CO2 bubbles. And so what you're basically doing is converting the bicarbonate into carbonic acid and CO2, and it can't stay in that carbonic acid form, and so it's released as CO2. And so that is actually you kind of forcing this carbonate buffering system. The same thing is true for carbonated beverages. So when you increase the pressure in a system, it allows more CO2 to be dissolved in the solution and not bubble out. So that's why carbonated beverages are kept under pressure. And when you pop the cap on a carbonated beverage, you release the pressure. And so you get a release of all of these bubbles. So carbonated beverages also must be slightly acidic to basically hold the system at that level where the CO2 can be released and to taste sparkly and bubbly on your tongue. So these are two kind of real world applications of the carbonate buffer system. And the other I mentioned previously, which is that your blood has a very similar system to make sure that your blood pH values stay really regulated. And so your blood relies on a similar kind of carbonate buffering system using slightly different compounds. Okay, so here are all those reactions again. And there are effects of photosynthesis on this system. So photosynthesis consumes CO2, and so it will shift the equilibrium to the right, resulting in a consumption of protons and an increase in pH and the formation of carbonate. Respiration, though, has the opposite effect because respiration releases CO2, then the equilibrium will shift to the left, resulting in a release of protons and a decrease in pH and the dissolution of carbonate. And so as aquatic systems experience respiration and photosynthesis, this the pH can change slightly, and this carbonate system is kind of being influenced. And finally, this is really cool. You can see this happening at the landscape scale. So limestone watersheds have significant amounts of dissolved bicarbonate in their waters. They can resist effects of acid rain, and this is basically they have high alkalinity. And many photosynthetic organisms can convert bicarbonate to CO2 and then basically photosynthesize with either bicarbonate or CO2. And limestone systems like these cave systems, you can see how the bicarbonate or how the limestone has been eroded by things like rainwater over time. The other thing that happens is that calcium carbonate or calcite can precipitate spontaneously when CO2 comes out of solution. So like if a spring with high dissolved calcium carbonate hits the air and the CO2 comes out of solution, it can precipitate this kind of really white material on the surface of rocks in the stream. And so this happens often at spring sources where waters are being degassed or in hot springs. And what's really neat is that there's a species of algae called a chara or stonewort, and they thrive in these habitats, and they're called stoneworts because the precipitation occurs on their cell surfaces, and so they feel really gritty. There's some really cool systems like at Yellowstone, and here shown in the bottom right, Fossil Creek in Arizona, where travertine is formed and these really neat dams. And so anything in the water that moves slow enough will have this kind of precipitated calcium carbonate travertine solution, or not solution, but precipitate. And so even large-bodied insects or long-lived insects like stonefly or like dragonflies will have this crusty kind of precipitate on their shells. And so it attaches to organic material and creates these kind of terraces, and the stream looks fossilized. That's why it's called Fossil Creek, and it has some really beautiful colors. So kind of like the Colorado River here, where we have some great calcium carbonate deposition, calcite deposition on all the surfaces, some really cool travertine formation. And because of this white precipitate, it reflects the color of the sky and has this amazing turquoise blue color. A similar system is at Mono Lake, where we have carbonate deposited by photosynthetic organisms, creating these what are called tufas, or these kind of towers of material. Really cool lake system. And then similarly, because of CO2 dissolved in water surfaces or in waters, we can have massive events like what happened at Lake Nyos in Cameroon. So Lake Nyos is a caldera, it was a volcano, and so it became just like a catchment after the volcano erupted, but it's meromictic, meaning it didn't mix. It doesn't have a lot of inlets or outlets. And so you had these kind of layers of fossil water below the surface. Well, unfortunately, in August of 1986, there was an event that caused the lake water to mix, and it brought a bunch of this kind of fossil water to the surface, and with it a whole bunch of dissolved CO2 and methane, and that stuff kind of leaked over the edge of the volcano and asphyxiated, killed over 1,700 people and 3,500 livestock. And at the same time, it brought up all of this iron from the bottom that then immediately rusted. It was oxidized by iron oxidizing bacteria. And so the lake went from being this beautiful blue lake, you can see here, to this rusty orange lake. So here's kind of a diagram of what happened. I think there was some volcanic activity that, and maybe some like earthquakes or miniature landslides in the lake itself that caused the water to turn over and mix, and that triggered this CO2 bubbling out of solution because the carbonate buffering system got kind of all messed up, and that heavier air full of CO2 flowed down the sides of the volcano and into the valleys and caused this massive mortality event. So what's happening since then is they installed this big pipe down into the lake so that it could reach past the chemocline in the lake to these lower layers of water that are rich in CO2. And the minute that they installed the pump, the pressure change, they started kind of pulling some water out of it. The pressure change allowed that CO2 to just start spouting up into the air. And so there's currently this kind of degassing system set up to try to keep the lake from having this, this next event. And hopefully it will be enough to protect people from another earthquake triggered landslide and lake mixing event. Okay, let's pause and move on to the next video.